from Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here, and welcome. Ahead today from Iowa State University, Lee Schulz. On the cattle markets, Lee will go over the U.S. Meat Export Federation's latest report on U.S. beef exports, which very much leans to the positive. Then from the IGP Institute here at K-State, Guy Allen offers his analysis of the USDA's latest World Grain Supply and Demand Report. Among other things, he'll comment on the escalating use of wheat as a feed grain in other parts of the world, and on the short second crop of corn coming out of South America. On this week's forage segment further ahead, Jeff Wickman talks with K-State's Michelle Beran about the online forage Clover Classroom Challenge. All that and more right here on Agriculture Today. Thanks for joining us for another Agriculture Today on the K-State Radio Network. Our lead topic on our Monday edition, the cattle market trends. And for those, this time around, we turn to livestock economist Lee Schulz of Iowa State University for his input. Lee, it's a broken record. We look at the fed cattle trade, and lo and behold, guess what? It's in the same place it's been for several weeks running.
It certainly is, Eric, and I think there's maybe two ways to look at that. Typically, we do see some seasonal pressure as we get into the summer months, and the fact that we're holding here, I think, provides a bit of optimism for some of these summer markets, at least until we can get into the fall where we're seeing much stronger futures prices. So the longer we can hold here, I think that it is at least helpful to the markets. Futures showed some optimism this last week, being up really across the board on those contracts. So, I think there's a hint that, we could see a bit of strength in the marketplace. The fact that feeder cattle were up for the week when we're having stronger corn prices, I think is leading into that optimism a bit.
Because flow of cattle has been such an issue of interest, what are we seeing as far as slaughter volumes and so forth? Are we still in relatively good shape?
So I think there's a lot of talk out there, in the countryside that, we're still trying to get current in those marketings. And that's the reason why that, we've seen prices stuck where they are. Slaughter levels are really maintaining, I think, pretty healthy levels. We can't compare to a year ago levels because of situation with COVID and then working through that backlog. But I think we've seen some pretty healthy slaughter levels work through the situations that we've seen with JBS, a few weeks ago. And we're seeing healthy slaughter levels, but those supplies still remain relatively large. Now, I think kind of the wild card in this is there's some consensus that the box beef prices have topped. If those start to soften, how much do those pressure cattle prices as we're kind of getting those dog days of summer?
Now, you tell us that you have been digging into various aspects of retail beef demand and some of the economic influences that may be arising here. Inflation, for instance, or something that resembles inflation anyway. What are you finding there that would be of interest for the longer pull as far as beef demand?
There's been a ton of talk about rising retail beef prices, how that's going to impact consumers. Do they start to back away from these higher prices? One of my favorite reports to look at week to week is from USDA and their national retail report. It's a real high-level report because it's aggregate pricing, but it gives us some of that real-time data on where those prices are. And they have several beef products in there. And when you look at it, there's some interesting patterns that you're seeing. Certainly, we're seeing higher prices. Where those higher prices are primarily coming from, though, is the middle meats. And so you can think about it, we're kind of getting back into maybe more typical pricing than we've seen, at least compared to last year. Last year, we had much higher ground beef prices. Ground beef prices today are much lower than they were a year ago. Really, anywhere from 10 to 25%, depending on what grind you're talking about. So importantly, I think there's still some deals out there, even though we're seeing some higher prices. And, consumers are going to be able to find, I think, some very competitive beef prices. But also they're going to see some higher prices too.
Well, don't want to overlook the international beef demand side of this. And there are new beef export numbers from the U.S. Meat Export Federation to pass along. What are those suggesting to us?
Last week, they released their summary. So this would be all the way back to April data, but this is really the official data. April exports, it was worth the wait, maybe to say that. We seen another record level for value. It was up 35% compared to a year ago. Volume was up 23%, fifth largest volume on record. So really, we continue the tune of very strong exports here in 2021 compared to year ago levels, but really even compared to historic levels. If you look at the more recent weekly data, that's through the first part of June, there's still quite a bit of optimism there. Accumulated exports for the year were up 15%. Outstanding sales is up over 60%. So I think there's a lot of potential to continue this momentum as far as exports. If you're looking at one really weak spot, I think it's Japan. Due to recovery of COVID there, just some restrictions. When we compare to year over year levels, they're down about 6%. But otherwise, we're seeing strength from a lot of countries, and China, being in record levels for that country.
Well, that is exceptionally good news. I want to spend the remainder of our time, Lee, commenting on something that you put together in an article on drought. You have thoughts to share on producers being prepared with management adjustments, whether that be with their inventory or with their forage supplies. What are some of the takeaways that you're talking up there?
And I think the key word there is preparation. Now, certainly, depending where you are in the country, we're on a much different continuum as far as drought-like conditions and how critical this time is for preparation. But I think, really, given where we're at and how some of this dryness has progressed, we need to have a plan in place as far as matching what your inventory levels are with your feed needs. And that's really important year to year, but in situations like this, it's certainly heightened. And I stress this because I think there's some short-term decisions that can be made that can have long-term ramifications. So, instead of liquidating animals, can we get ahead of this in some hay prices that are actually pretty good price? They haven't seen the escalation that corn prices have seen. So maybe purchasing hay now would be pretty prudent just to prepare if hay supplies, forage supplies become very short here this summer and into next fall and winter.
There is a measure of feed demand that you think producers might be able to utilize in making decisions on what their needs will be in as far as forages as they look forward, and then any other decisions that would link to that. It's something called the Roughage Consuming Animal Unit Measurement. What is that, and what is the value of that to the individual beef producer?
Yeah, so I think many analysts use that in their balance sheet to kind of understand what the demand for hay is going to be in a particular year. And the supply figure, I think, it is relatively easy to get at because we know our May 1 hay stocks, so what we came into the season with, and then we know what those animal levels are. So beef cow numbers being a huge one, feedlots, dairies, and then we can work our way down into sheep and goats, equine, so on and so forth, all the way to export. So that's the demand standpoint of who's going to need that forage that's available. Now, the tricky one is understanding what that demand's truly going to be, and that's dependent on what our hay and pasture conditions are. And we're starting out pretty bad relative to where we've been historically. Here in Iowa, it's the worst since 2012. If you look at nationally, because the West is dealing with such drought, it's been much longer since we've seen this bad of conditions, and it may be even in that historic category. So there, that demand is really tricky. One interesting statistic I see when you look at those hay and pasture conditions, in that USDA report, the poor and very poor says there's supplemental feeding needed. And, given where you are, we're seeing those poor and very poor conditions much worse than we've seen. So we're already starting to supplement some of those cows that are on pasture. That's eating into our May 1 stocks and has that potential to really see some inflation in hay prices in the next couple months potentially.
One important thing to continue to stress here, though, is even if you were a producer in an area not ravaged by drought, at least not at the moment, these hay market effects will fan out beyond just the drought areas. So producers keeping a watchful eye on that is important.
They certainly will. And you know, hay is something that's not that easy to move around, right. But there's also, that creates opportunities too. Because you'll see some regions that have surplus, you'll see some regions that have deficit. I think there's some real market opportunities that can occur. And I would encourage both sides of that, both the supply and demand, to not wait until it's too late. So there's ways to really, I think, see some value from marketing that forage and also see some value from purchasing that forage when we're seeing some very dynamic conditions that are really changing week to week here.
Yeah. Lee, we appreciate your insight as always. Thanks for the comments, and we will talk again in a few weeks. Take care.
Thank you.
Lee Schulz with us for this week's cattle market segment. Lee is a livestock economist at Iowa State University. Welcome back to Agriculture Today. Well, a couple of days back, the USDA provided another World Agricultural Supply and Demand Estimates report. A large part of that, of course, has to do with grain supply and demand around the globe. And good enough to join us following each of these reports is the senior economist with the IGP Institute here at K-State, Guy Allen, for his observations on what the numbers mean to the international grain trade and then, of course, to the markets. And we'll start with wheat. World wheat production was up from the previous month's estimate from the USDA, Guy.
Well, yeah, we reported world wheat production at a record of 794 million metric tons, and the USDA rose that by 5.5 million tons versus their last month estimate. That compares to up 18.6 million metric tons from last year. Just to put that world number in perspective, U.S. production of wheat this season is expected to be about 51.6 million metric tons. Note with these production estimates, a lot of the world competitors have increased their production significantly, definitely in response to higher world prices across all commodities there. In particular, Europe, the Black Sea regions of Russia and the Ukraine, as well as Argentina. And it looks like the U.S. is going to have plenty of competition in the export markets for wheat in particular.
Important then that demand keep up with supply. So what does that look like as you read the report numbers?
Well, the demand situation for wheat, it's still at a discount to corn in a lot of places, not only in Kansas and the hard red winter wheat situation, but also in other regions around the world. And we're going to basically see a lot of wheat feeding, particularly I think just this last quarter and the next quarter, the first quarter of the wheat marketing year, the fourth quarter of the coarse grains marketing year. I think we're going to have substantial wheat feeding. Could be as high as 125.7 million metric tons. That was increased by just over 2 million metric tons from last month and 7.3 million tons higher than last year. And I'd actually suggest that number could probably go higher. A lot of it's going to be dependent on the quality of the wheat crop, but I think the quality of the wheat around the world this year, depending on weather as we go through harvest, knock on wood, is going to be quite good.
But this wheat feeding won't be restricted to the U.S. It's happening worldwide.
Yeah, no, it's happening in Europe, particularly in China. The one we're watching closest is probably China, as the imports of wheat and the imports of corn, I think, to some extent are a one-to-one relationship. I think while the Chinese are importing milling wheat, they're the second largest producer of world wheat. They're feeding a lot of wheat at this point in time into their feed ration just due to the high price of corn. I guess the interesting thing in wheat is that spread between classes, between soft wheat and spring wheat, which is really struggling this season, although some recent rains have have made us a bit more optimistic on that in the last few days.
Let's shift over to the coarse grains, including corn, what the USDA's supply and demand numbers suggested there. And you put a backdrop on this guy, calling this definitely a weather market in play right now.
Yeah, look, the June WASDE is sort of an in-between report. In May, we get a look at the first look at the next marketing year of 21-22. In July, we'll get some confirmation on the planted acres on that. Overall, it was quite a mixed report, and that definitely showed up in corn and soybeans. Corn and soybeans are a bit more interesting, particularly for the U.S., where we've got very, very tight ending stocks for beans, and global ending stocks for corn are quite tight, and it continues, I think, to be the driver of the market. They did raise the beginning stocks for this current marketing year of 2021 slightly, about 2.5 million metric tons. That is going to have an impact, a bit more optimistic impact on ending stocks for this season. But global output for coarse grains was up fractionally, just 660,000 metric tons to 1,496 metric tons for global coarse grains production. Of that, corn production is about 1,190 million metric tons, making up the biggest bulk volume of that. Probably the biggest increases that we've seen in coarse grains production has actually been in barley, which we don't see a lot of that around the U.S. much anymore, but particularly Europe and Canada has seen good increases in barley production.
And, of course, when we talk of the coarse grains and corn specifically, wondering what's happening in South America with its crop, which competes directly with our export interest for corn.
Look, the key component of South American crop is going to be this Brazilian second crop, Safrinha corn, and it's been struggling quite a bit with dry weather. And the USDA did drop that by 3.5 million metric tons to bring their total corn production to 98.5, and that takes exports down 2 million metric tons to 33 million metric tons. Now, that crop's key because it kind of bridges this gap between the Southern Hemisphere crop and into North American harvest. And we've seen a very good premium or inverse in the marketplace for nearby corn. And as you tighten up those Brazilian supplies, that's going to definitely keep that early sale or quick ship premium in that market. And I think that's going to persist through harvest in the U.S. this season, even with a large crop. Early sales and early deliveries, I think, will be able to capture a premium compared to later sales.
And China's still the heavy hitter in the corn market?
Yeah, corn imports for China, USDA left unchanged at 26 million metric tons. I'm probably a bit more optimistic than that, but there is some question on to particularly their hog production at the moment, which there has been for some time. But just watching the weekly meal or the crush numbers and soybean numbers would sort of indicate meal demand is falling off a bit. Prices have come down for hogs in China quite significantly in the last month, and that would sort of indicate readily available supplies. But I don't know, with the meal numbers dropping off, you sort of question that. You just can't get consistent information out of China on that. But, look, they left the next year's imports at 26 million metric tons. I'd actually suggest if they do get a recovery in their hog numbers, I sort of look for the next year's number for China's total corn imports to be larger again than they were this year.
What about oil seeds? Let's close.
Moving to oil seeds, they've been quite volatile. Again, it's sort of a South American story at the moment, but they left Argentine numbers unchanged. I think Argentine production is 47 million metric tons. Well, they did increase the Brazilian numbers up 1 million to 137 million metric tons of production. Exports were left basically unchanged for those countries. Chinese imports, they were left steady. They're the biggest importer of oilseeds around the world at 100 million metric tons, and looking forward to next year at a new record of 103 million metric tons of soybean imports to China. And again, that's based, I think, on expected recovery of the livestock sector as well as growing demand in China. I guess the key thing to point out about both feed grains and oil seeds, the meal complex, we've seen good demand from that livestock sector. That said, when we look at the components with these higher prices, I think we're starting to see some demand rationing there. We've definitely seen it in U.S. crush and meal and oil values. USDA did reduce the soybean meal demand globally by 390,000 tons, and next year they trimmed it by 430,000 metric tons. Oil, they've actually revised oil demand up to 59.6 million metric tons of oil. And then for next year, 2.2 million metric ton increase, taking total world demand to 61.89 million metric tons. And we're seeing good demand in the oil situation coming from the biofuels. As people return to travel and stronger oil prices, we're seeing good demand for that biofuel sector. We did set a new contract high for palm oil last week. I think pretty much every day last week we had a down day for palm oil. And the revision on the palm oil numbers actually helped support a bit of a bigger supply there than maybe what was originally anticipated a month ago.
Then, looking at, both coarse grains and oil seeds and what you just shared, there don't seem to be, Guy, very many, if any, red flags as far as market direction and so forth.
Well, timely rains across a number of places in the world has really helped not only the U.S., but we saw timely rains, particularly in former Soviet Union, Ukraine, and parts of Europe. Mexico got some timely rains, but it's still quite hot and dry. Canada, it's still dry in that area. Australia, as I mentioned earlier, is looking very good, and I think their production numbers will be increased. As last year they had a record production year, and I think this year will challenge that again, although it's unusual for them to have two record crops in a row. China, though, is wet, and the one thing that we're going to start watching now, particularly from a weather point of view, is the Indian monsoon season is starting, and that's key for crop production, not only in India, but a number of places around Southeast Asia and adjacent regional areas, as those rains are key for crop production.
All right. Well, we'd remind the listeners that you post regularly your observations on the international grain markets on the agmanager.info website out of K-State. We always appreciate your summary of this particular monthly report. Guy, thanks for coming over.
Thank you, Eric.
He's the senior economist with the IGP Institute here at Kansas State University, Guy Allen. We'll be back with more for you. You're listening to Agriculture Today. Broadcasting from the campus of Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here, and on we go now to today's lead stories in agricultural news. These courtesy in part of DTN. Responding to increasing calls from lawmakers and cattle producers, the USDA on Friday announced that the department will start working on new rules to tighten enforcement of the Packers and Stockyards Act. First, the USDA intends to propose a new rule that will provide greater clarity to strengthen enforcement of unfair and deceptive practices, undue preferences, and unjust prejudices. Second, the USDA says it will propose a new poultry grower tournament system rule. With the current inactive proposal to be withdrawn, the USDA had attempted to change the poultry tournament system under the Obama administration, but had failed then. Third, then, the USDA will repropose a rule to clarify that parties do not need to demonstrate harm to competition to bring an action under the Packers and Stockyards Act. Multiple federal court rulings against individual producers have stated that practices by packers that may have harmed a single producer were not extensive enough to cause competitive injury to overall livestock markets. Now, the USDA stated on Friday that the planned Packers and Stockyards Act proposals will support the USDA's efforts to ensure fairer and more resilient markets for farmers, ranchers, and other producers. The National Cattlemen's Beef Association has filed a petition with the USDA's Food Safety and Inspection Service now to eliminate the use of product of the USA and other broad U.S. origin labeling claims for beef products that are potentially misleading to consumers. The group said they view the current product of the USA as not providing a service to consumers, as it's not based, they say, on any verification program, food safety standard, and it does not deliver value, says the association, back to the cattle producer. The NCBA believes the current product of the USA labels are a disservice to American consumers and cattle producers alike, the group says. They also pointed out that imported products can be labeled as a product of the USA if they've been minimally processed or repackaged in a USDA-inspected facility. NCBA president and Kansas cattle producer Jerry Bone said that there is a growing desire among consumers to know more about the origin of the food they purchase, and that it's critical that producers are empowered with opportunities to market their high-quality beef in a way that allows them to differentiate the source of their product from competitors and potentially increase profitability. The NCBA said they support voluntary efforts that allow producers to get more value of their products via origin labels, marketing initiatives that are voluntary and source verified. And the association is advocating for a more appropriate generic label, such as processed in the USA. The group says they want to work with the Agricultural Marketing Service to educate stakeholders in the industry to develop voluntary, verifiable origin marketing claims that deliver benefits to producers but don't violate U.S. trade commitments. And the USDA earlier this year announced it had reviewed the Conservation Reserve Program and had put in place higher rental payments, new incentives, and more focus on climate change. Given those changes, the USDA has now deleted all offers submitted under the continuous CRP Sign-Up 55 and the general CRP Sign-Up 56. The USDA said there will be a one-time 10% inflationary adjustment for the life of the CRP contract, which will be factored into the soil rental rates. As for the Climate Smart Practice Incentive effort, the USDA said the incentives will be 10% for woody biomass, 5% for grass and legumes, and 3% for grass cover types. The USDA also said that the state acres for wildlife enhancement practices are being moved from the general CRP sign-up to the continuous sign-up. Now, CRP offers can be resubmitted starting today. The deadline is July the 23rd now for offers under the general sign-up and a deadline of August the 6th for the continuous sign-up. Contracts are to start October the 1st for the general, and the continuous sign-up offers for re-enrolled or a combination of re-enrolled and new acres. For offers on new acres only under the continuous sign-up, contracts start the first of the month after the month that the offer has been approved. Those submitting offers under CRP previously will be getting letters advising them of this new sign-up. And by the way, tomorrow on the next installment of FSA Coffee Talk here on Agriculture Today, we'll get more information on these CRP changes from Carla Wyckoff of the Farm Service Agency State Office. The USDA will be conveying farmer concerns on federal rules like the waters of the U.S., according to the Deputy Agriculture Secretary. Here's more from the USDA's Stephanie Ho.
USDA will have input in federal efforts that affect agricultural producers.
When you're talking about issues like waters of the U.S., we want to make sure at all times that when decisions are made by partnering agencies that could adversely affect our farmers and ranchers, that we want to be at the table, and we are always at the table.
Deputy Agriculture Secretary Jewel Brenagh referred to the rule that is being handled by the Environmental Protection Agency.
I read about the article, of course, this morning, and there's a lot to discuss around waters of the U.S. as we go forward.
She added that she has regular meetings with her counterparts in other agencies.
And one thing that Secretary Vilsack has said to me is, do not be afraid to speak up. So I see it in my role that when decisions are made that adversely affect American agriculture, it is my job to speak up.
This is Stephanie Ho for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
And U.S. tractor sales took their first dip in a year last month. The decline 3.9% compared to May of 2020, led by a fall-off in unit sales of smaller tractors. Sales of large four-wheel drive tractors, on the other hand, rose sharply, up 62% last month compared to May of 2020. This is from the latest report on ag tractor and combine sales released by the Association of Equipment Manufacturers. There was an 8% drop in sales of sub-40 horsepower tractors compared to May of 20. That was a decline of about 2,200 units. Even with that slight dip, sales of small tractors in 21 are still up more than 20,000 units over the same 5-month period in 2020. Four-wheel drive sales are good. Manufacturers selling 253 of those units in May of this year compared to 156 a year ago. For the year, four-wheel drive tractor sales stand at 1,180 through May. That is up almost 20%, or 196 units, over the same period last year. That's a glance at today's agricultural news headlines for you. You're listening to Agriculture Today, and Jeff Wickman is standing by now to bring this week's forage segment. You're tuned to the K-State Radio Network.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Eric Atkinson, I'm Jeff Wickman. Kansas youth looking for a challenge this summer should check out the Kansas 4-H Clover Classroom. Michelle Beran, a 4-H youth development agent in K-State Research and Extension's Cottonwood District, says the state's largest youth development program has nearly a dozen activities online for youth that enhance learning, leadership, and community service. Michelle, first, maybe just some background on the Clover Classroom Project challenges. How did all of this come about?
The Clover Classroom challenges came about initially through one of our agents that was doing this in her local district. She was putting together some things by working with other agents in her district to put together some educational opportunities for the youth in their area. When the pandemic hit last year, we were, as a larger group, our Northwest 4-H Advisory Group, really got together and said, how do we reach out to young people when we can't meet face-to-face? How do we provide good educational opportunities for youth of all ages, and at the same time expose perhaps some of our non-4-H youth to 4-H backgrounds and foundations and project learning.
And now that summer is here and students are officially out of school, this is another good opportunity for them to continue with those projects.
It absolutely is. If they go to kansas4h.org, under the Clover Classroom, there's, I believe, 11 project challenges out there right now. We're continuing to add to that as we move those through our pipeline of background writing, research, editing, all of the pieces that have to happen to make that a publishable document. The nice part is they're available through our bookstore, and they can be downloaded for free. So we really encourage families to go out, take a look at any number of those project areas. Certainly for our 4-Hers, you don't have to be enrolled in that area in order to learn about something. So it might be a great way for a 4-Her to explore a project that they want to enroll in next year, or for non-4-H families to take a look at some activities, some learning opportunities, all of those things to really expand and keep kids busy this summer and keep them learning.
Yeah, a great way to expand their knowledge base. And let's talk a little bit more about some of these in detail as to how they're set up, how they work. For instance, what about like photography? What goes on with that challenge?
There are some great pieces to photography. The initial photography challenge really takes a young person from the very basic level. This is something they could literally do from their cell phone or a point and shoot. They don't need a fancy camera to do this, but it helps them really understand the principles behind photography, some things to look for when they're looking at setting up a shot, and really get them started with some basic knowledge. It'll take them through some activities, some things to try and to do, and then at the end of that, we have some open-ended questions for them to fill out for their own learning, and then we do have a survey that we ask them to fill out that gives us some feedback, one, to help us prepare additional challenges, but also to constantly improve those challenges, but also to give us a gauge for what they've learned out of that process.
One of the things I noticed that might be fun now that they can get together again is the foods and nutrition, quick bread versus yeast bread. That could be a fun activity for a number of youth.
It certainly could. That could be something that a family could get together and do a couple of those activities as a family group. I think that would be a neat way to have some great family time. But also, maybe you get 2 or 3 neighbor kids together or a 4-H club that's working on some foods project to get a group of kids together, go through that as an activity, and really have that learning piece with some good discussion as well as the hands-on activities.
Horticulture, another area that is popular within the 4-H program, and in this case, they'd be working with pollinators?
They sure would. One of our horticulture agents really has a passion and a knowledge for pollinator gardens, and she really shared that with this challenge in helping them really understand what pollinators are, what they do for our environment, and why it's important that we continue to provide them with food and shelter resources and how we can go about doing that. So it really walks them through the basics of what the pollinators are, what they do, and then how they can plant a pollinator garden, how they can share that with others. 4-H is all about leadership opportunities also, and so especially for older youth, we would encourage them to take on some of the leadership pieces that are included in there that may include sharing that with a library group or sharing that with a group of other 4-Hers, other youth in maybe a classroom setting, at a library program, something along those lines, but to really encourage them to not only learn it themselves, but then share it with someone else. Because we know that that's one of the best ways to learn something is if you have to teach it to another.
Communications is another big aspect of 4-H, and there's a couple of different challenges along those lines as well.
Absolutely. We really wanted to put together a series really of challenges, and there is a third one in the works. And so the first one really just talks about the basics of how do you put together a presentation, whether that's a project talk, a demonstration, an illustrated talk, what the differences are in those pieces, and then how to understand the format to put that together to have a really effective presentation. The second one, the dynamic displays. If you've ever watched a 4-H talk, you know that often having some boards, some posters to help convey their message is an important piece. Some people are really good at this, others are not, and I am one of those that's not my wheelhouse. And so I could really look at this and say, how do I make my posters, my presentation pieces stronger so that it helps share the message of whatever piece I am presenting that day? And so, as you said, communications is a really strong part of our 4-H foundation. And so we wanted to provide not only our 4-H youth, but any youth who is going to be presenting for their science fair, preparing maybe for a forensics or some of those kind of things. Some pieces are a little bit different than what you'll use in some of those, and some are not. There's always things that you can learn from any of them, but we really wanted them to have that step-by-step process to really build strong communication skills.
And you really have made this well-rounded. You've got health and wellness. You've also got some STEM. You've got some wildlife. So really there is something there for just about anybody who wants to take a challenge this summer.
Absolutely. And that was one of our focuses. We looked at our top project areas and we kind of tried to focus on those areas first. And one of the things that is great is we have agents all across our state that as 4-H agents or ag or family consumer science agents, they have some particular areas that they are passionate about. They have some real strengths in. The wildlife challenge that you mentioned, one of our agents, a couple of them work together on that, but one in particular has an incredible background with wildlife information, with understanding wildlife habitat. And so that was a great piece for that agent to be able to share that information in a format that really can reach a great number of youth.
And again, all of these challenges are on the 4-H website, and how can they find that?
That is at kansas4-h.org. I would encourage anybody who goes out and takes a look to check back. Right now we're coming into fair season, so it'll be a little hard for us to get a whole lot of new ones out over the next probably 4 to 6 weeks. But we've got several of them in the works that'll be coming out before too long, and we've got several that are in the planning stages that we'll be rolling out as soon as we can get back to that development piece in the fall.
That's Michelle Beran, a 4-H Youth Development Agent in K-State Research and Extension's Cottonwood District, with information on the Kansas 4-H Clover Classroom Challenge. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Eric Atkinson, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.